really none of your business. It's none of my business.
Hello, Fáilte, bonjour, and welcome to the next installment of the Motivated Classroom August Spotlight. Today is day 15 already, day 15, we're halfway through almost. And today's episode I'm focusing on the absolutely fantastic and quite recent episode I had with the brilliant Cécile Lainé. It was such a pleasure to talk to Cécile. I know she was in Agen this summer and I missed her. We still haven't met in person, Cécile, but that day will come. It was just a brilliant discussion, and I've got to say I love so many things about this. Cécile, I'm cursing you right now because making the notes for this August Spotlight, I have 6 pages of quotes and notes that I liked from our episode. So I don't know how I'm going to try and get that into a short video, but I'll try. So many brilliant things, and I loved Cécile's bravery, vulnerability and honesty with talking about the reality of how things are in her classroom, and maybe saying things that, you know, maybe other teachers are afraid to say about language acquisition, and that we have another role to play that is not just language acquisition, but we are teachers of young people and we have to think about that too. So I just thought she was really brave in some of the things she said. So I'll try and go through some of the key things I've got here. So at the beginning she talked about story listening in middle school being a bit kind of, oh, it didn't go that well, or sometimes it did because they're middle schoolers, but then about the joy that she had in primary school and in secondary school, and about how she would kind of sometimes miss things out of the story and because they would read it the next day. And so she says things like, so inevitably I would miss a couple of things, and I started noticing that the next day when we read the story together, they would catch the things that I had omitted. So I started doing it on purpose. And now it became almost like the next day you have to find the mistakes or the facts that I've changed. And then it became almost like a game, and it was so successful breaking my program into a 4-day week, or from a 4-day week into 2, with cultural content, developing intercultural in competence. So I thought that was really nice, you know, just the fact that it became this little game of the students trying to find what was different between the way she told the story and then reading it the next day. And then I loved when Cécile talked about the myths and misconceptions about story listening. And the first one she really addressed was, I think one of the greatest barriers to implementing story listening in the classroom is that lots of teachers think the students are just passively listening. And it's hard to trust and to believe that if they're just listening, acquisition is going to occur. I would say this has not been my experience at all. Students may not be doing anything while they're listening to the story. That is true. They're not taking notes, they're not drawing, they're just focusing on the story. But they are listening and they are engaged. They are making comments that show me they're listening. I have a simple rule: your comments are welcome. They help me to make sure that you're following the story. I just ask that they're relevant in French, I should say, French or Franglish. She's a French teacher. And I thought that was lovely that, yeah, there's this misconception that if, you know, a supervisor or a principal walked into your classroom and you're just telling a story and the kids are just listening. And even I'm saying the word just listening, but listening intently to a second language and trying to decipher the code in there about what's happening in the story and follow that story. There's so much going on behind the eyes. There's so much acquisition occurring there, and we have to trust that that is happening. And then she talks about vocabulary. So another misconception is that students will not retain any vocab because we are just telling one story and then we move on to another one that may or may not bring those same words back. How do we expect them to acquire vocab if we're not using those same words over and over? And I think that that's really, really important that she pointed that out, because people do think that. So she talks about then trying to replicate the research that Dr. Benico Mason had done. And she says, I was completely blown away at how much vocabulary retention there was with just 3 stories, even 6 weeks down the road. That's really how story listening is so efficient. It sticks there for a long time. So there is something about story listening that makes students retain the vocabulary for much longer than with other methods. Again, you know, I see this with my own daughter right now, who's acquiring her first language, of course. She will come out or be able to point out words to me that I feel like she must have only heard once or twice from a story, because we haven't even read it that many times. But I don't know, like something like if there's a picture and it was a picture of a swan or something, and like she'll point it out straight away, like swan, and I'm like, how do you know that word? Or like maybe we crossed it once in a story, but like it's just incredible that the retention that can be there from words that occur in stories. And she'll often recount stories to me of things that I've made up, little stories to her. She'll tell me them back the next day, and obviously in very broken, toddler language, but it shows you the power of story. And this alludes to the next point that Cécile makes. She says, the thing that's really important is to trust the process. And again, Alice Ayel and Benico spoke about this, Dr. Krashen spoke about this, Adriana spoke about this. It's a recurring theme. It takes trust in the fact that story listening will lead to acquisition. So the first thing we need to do as teachers is let's check that. Let's read about it. Let's do our research. Let's do our investigation so that we can build our own trust in the method. If we don't trust it, then the students are going to feel that it's shaky. So trust the process. That was really good. And then finally, there's two really nice things that she says afterwards. One of them was about vocabulary from a textbook being forced into a story. And she says, if I have one piece of advice for teachers who are using a textbook or a curriculum and they want to use story listening, please do not try to incorporate the vocab from your textbook into a story. What's going to happen is you're going to run yourself into the ground trying to find the right story to bring in your vocab list. Instead, do a 10-minute story. It may or may not be related to what you're doing with the textbook. Just do story listening the way it was intended to be. Cast a wide net. Find an interesting story and cast that wide net. After 10 to 15 minutes, move on to your textbook, your curriculum, whatever you have to do. And just watch what happens after a few weeks, how much your students are going to comprehend. And that's so important. People frequently say this to me in my workshops, but I don't have time for this with my curriculum, or I don't have time for a special person interview, or I don't have time to do this comprehensive input activity, or I don't have time for me just to talk about my holidays with the kids. But you are giving them input and they're listening intently and they are learning lots of different words through that all the time. And this is the same type thing. Just giving them a story gives them more inputs, builds the system more. The final thing I want to draw attention to is what Cécile talked about like, is story listening enough? And she was really eloquent in the way that she put across the fact that yes, it is 100% enough if the only thing you're worried about is language acquisition and acquiring language. If that's the only thing, it is 100% enough. But the reality is most of us listening to this work in busy schools, and there are things going on that mean we have to do more than just language acquisition. So she says, I just want to challenge a bit that language acquisition is the only thing we're doing as teachers. I have found that story listening is not enough to do that. I can develop the intercultural conference. Sorry, I'm going to say that again. I just want to challenge a little bit that language acquisition is the only thing we're doing as teachers. I have found that story listening is not enough to do the intercultural competence part. So let me define what that means. It's the ability to understand and respect each other across all types of potential cultural barriers. It's building that empathy muscle. My middle schoolers are social beings. They bring their whole social being with them. If I don't have interactions in my classroom, I'm not meeting their social needs. From a pure methodological standpoint, it is really a beautiful method and so efficient. Story listening also brings a lot of pleasure, telling stories, being a good story together, but it's not enough if you're to bring the intercultural competence into the mix, and if you're trained to meet your students where they are with all the other needs they're bringing into your classroom. We are not in a vacuum. We work in a school. We work with students that bring all kinds of things to our classroom. Merci, Cécile. So beautifully put, and I love how you said that story listening is wonderful. It is brilliant on so many levels, but there are many other things that we can bring into the mix that will help students to build, as you say, that empathy muscle, that intercultural competence. And we can do that with special person interviews. We can do that with building stories together. We can do that with reading novels written from, a particular cultural standpoint, written by the own voices authors. We can do that by looking at different things about the culture and speaking about our own connections to that and how that draws on aspects of us and who we are. So thank you, Cécile, for an amazing episode, but also I am not thanking you for the amount of time and notes you've given me here to try and get through. How am I supposed to get this down into 100 or 200 words from my book? What am I supposed to do there, Cécile? You're not helping me with that. It was amazing, Cécile. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup, and I'll see you all tomorrow.